Hey guys, it's April 26th and this is our last video in Parkinson's Disease Awareness Month. I got a comment from Becca Ford last week in response to one of the videos, and she asked a great question. She wanted to know about the impact of food and what we know about its relationship to diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. So since we're still in PD Awareness Month, I'm going to kick off a series about foods and what we know about them in terms of the relationship with the disease. And I hope that today's topic is very stimulating because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite substances, which is coffee.
Right.
So coffee, I could talk about coffee all day long, and that's not really the purpose of this talk. But it is interesting to see how, at least in the United States, the consumption of coffee has changed over the past 150 years from kind of a nasty beverage that was really just consumed to get that kick of caffeine so that you could get through the day, to now more artisan type craft brew coffees. There are coffee shops virtually on every street corner, which also serves as kind of the social aspect to the drink that wasn't there 100 years ago, again, at least in this country. So now coffee is something that you can enjoy, when you're trying to do some work or if you're out with your friends, various times of the day. So that's led many people to wonder, well, are there some benefits to drinking all this coffee, or can it even harm us? And so I want to focus the rest of this video on just that, and then we'll end up with what we know about the relationship between Parkinson's disease and coffee consumption. What are the effects of coffee on the body? First, we'll talk outside the brain. If you're a coffee consumer, you're probably well aware of these effects. Number one, coffee is a diuretic. It can cause you to pee more than you would otherwise. Similarly, it can also cause increased peristalsis, or movement through the GI system, and so some people may end up with diarrhea when they consume coffee. Now, another thing that has gained some attention is what the effect of coffee is on blood pressure. Some people would think, well, coffee gets you kind of jazzed up, so it must cause your blood pressure to go up. And, the jury's really out on that. There was a fairly large study done not long ago that looked at all of the literature on the relationship between coffee consumption and elevated blood pressure. And they found no consistent relationship of coffee on causing your blood pressure to be higher. So from that, they weren't able to make any recommendations about increasing or decreasing coffee consumption to affect the blood pressure. With that being said, there was low level of evidence. So I think the studies are lacking, and the jury's kind of still out on that. So let's bring it back into the brain for the purposes of our YouTube channel, Long Live the Brains. We know that coffee is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is not really something that I've talked about, but it's essentially a very specialized boundary that protects the brain and the nervous system from everything outside of it. And while this is good for protecting us from harmful things, it can be a headache for pharmaceutical companies as they try to develop drugs that can get through this blood-brain barrier to have direct access to the brain. But we know that coffee and caffeine, I guess I should say that coffee consists of many different compounds. We'll focus a lot on the caffeine aspect, but there are other things to be considered, and we'll probably save those for another talk at another time. But we know that caffeine can cross the blood-brain barrier. And why is that important? Well, it has a role, or its effect is that it causes us to be jazzed up. And how does it do that? Well, it does it in a number of ways. One that we know is that it affects the concentration of a neurotransmitter. Remember, those are chemicals in the brain that really make things happen. And that neurotransmitter is called GABA. GABA tends to relax us. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it causes other neurons to be less likely to fire action potentials. And we know that caffeine decreases the concentration of GABA within the brain. So that may have something to do with why it causes us to have a heightened sense of alertness and can help us to stay awake. Now, what are the effects of coffee and caffeine on Parkinson's disease? Well, this is actually a question that's gotten a lot of research over the past couple of decades. And I'll remind you that a large part of the research process relies on animal models. Now, these are a variety of animals. They can be fruit flies to certain types of fish and mice and rats, and even non-human primates or monkeys in some cases. And these animal models are very important for us to understand the sort of basic sides of research, help us to test out therapies on disease models, because if they work in these animal models, then they're one step closer to getting to prime time where we can actually give these treatments, potential cures to human beings. But it would be unethical to just start testing potential treatments on humans right out the gate when we don't know what they do, how they work. And so animal models are a huge part of the research process. So first off, we're going to talk about what the findings have been in animal models. And I think I mentioned in a previous video that we do have some animal models of Parkinson's disease. There's a compound called MPTP that we use to induce a state of Parkinsonism in mice. And there have been a few studies that have looked at what happens when these MPTP induced Parkinson's disease models in mice are exposed to caffeine. And what we found is there actually seems to be a neuroprotective effect on the neurons in the brain that produce dopamine. Now, there's another disease model in rats that was the 6-hydroxydopamine model. And we also found that caffeine seems to have a neuroprotective role for these as well. So that kind of stirred the pot, if you will, and said, hey, maybe we should look at the effects in actual humans and try to understand what the relationship is. So that's exactly what we've done. And there have been various types of research studies done. I'll kind of give you a little bit of background. We have different types of research studies. Retrospective studies are kind of looking back to try to understand relationships. Prospective studies are really sort of looking forward, trying to understand relationships. We have randomized controlled trials where you have a large group of people and you give some people a treatment and other people may get a placebo, and then you monitor their effects moving forward. And we've actually got some pretty good trials on coffee and caffeine consumption. So there was a great review that came out, and I'll put the reference in my show notes, but there was a great review that came out talking about all the studies that have been done from 1968 to 2018 looking at the neuroprotective effects of coffee. And 5 studies looked at the effect of coffee on the progression of symptomatic enhancement in Parkinson's disease. And the results were somewhat contradictory. Some of that is related to how the studies were performed. They were performed at different times by different people, so they weren't, identical in terms of methodology. So it was a little bit difficult to make a judgment, but I will point your attention to one trial that came out and was published in a good journal, that's Movement Disorders, in 2007. And they found that coffee consumption actually caused improvement in freezing of gait. Now remember, that's one thing that patients with Parkinson's disease may experience, which is freezing of gait. And it is exactly what it sounds like it is, where you're walking along and then your feet just won't go. You freeze. And so they found that coffee consumption could actually decrease this freezing of gait phenomenon, but it tended to wear off after a period of time. However, they found that if they removed coffee from the diet for a couple of weeks and then reintroduced it, they could get it to the repeat effect where there was some benefit to be had against freezing of gait. So that's certainly suggestive that coffee has some kind of an impact on the underlying issues of the disease. There have also been other studies that have measured small improvements in the UPDRS, which is a rating scale that we use to kind of quantify the severity of symptoms. There seems to be a consistent finding that coffee and caffeine consumption can improve somnolence, which can sometimes occur in Parkinson's disease. So another set of studies, there were 9 prospective studies that looked at the effects of coffee and caffeine, and all of them, and I'm quoting here, found evidence for a significant beneficial effect of coffee consumption on the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So we're not talking about what it does to the symptoms once someone has Parkinson's disease, but what can it actually do to affect your risk of developing the disease. And most recently, there was a study that looked at over 500,000 people, and they found that there was an inverse relationship between coffee consumption and the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And when they talk about coffee consumption, they were really looking at about 3 to 4 cups of coffee per day. This effect tended to be larger in men, but they also noticed the effect in women. There have also been some case control studies that have shown that coffee consumption is inversely associated with the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And there was even a retrospective study that showed a delay in the onset of Parkinson's disease by almost 5 years for individuals that drink 3 or more cups of coffee per day. Now, this is by no means the end-all, be-all, 100% coffee is protective. We don't know. There's still much work that needs to be done. But at least from this, it doesn't appear that there's a downside of moderate or mild coffee consumption daily, and there may even be some benefit to be had in preventing Parkinson's disease, maybe even alleviating some of the symptoms. It can certainly help you stay more awake. Although, if you are consuming a lot of caffeine, and if you've ever tried to cut off cold turkey from coffee consumption, it can cause a pretty gnarly headache. So I would urge you to be cautious if you decide to do that. But I hope this talk has kind of kicked off the whole diet in Parkinson's disease series. I hope you found it interesting. I'll probably be talking about coffee just randomly in these videos coming in the future, because coffee is something that I think is very interesting, and I'm finishing up with my Ethiopian blend this morning, and I hope you have a great day.